Camera Raw's tone curve allows us to make finely tuned adjustments to brightness and contrast. But before we get started, I should point out that the tone curve is meant to be used after going through the adjustments in the Basic tab. This tool is meant for subtle, finely tuned adjustments, not as a replacement for the global editing controls in the Basic tab. With the tone curve, we're going to isolate our edits to pixels based on their brightness level. Now I've got Camera Raw open here with the images that we selected in the previous lesson, and I'd like for you to scroll down to the very bottom and you'll see a file called Tone Curve. If you do not have your images open, you can find Tone Curve in the Chapter 8 folder. Now this image you can see in the Basic panel has some adjustments made to it already. I'll turn these adjustments off so you can see where we started. I'll set it to Camera Raw defaults. That's where the image began. And I'll go back here and choose image settings. So you can see that we've gone from a flat, dull, low contrast image to a version that's much more pleasing. But let's go into the Curves tab here. That's the second icon just to the right of the Basic tab. And we've actually got two curves here. We're going to start with the parametric curve first. The interesting thing about the parametric curve is it offers us a number of ways to work. You can see that we have four sliders here: highlights, lights, darks, and shadows. And we can adjust those regions of the image simply by dragging the sliders. If I wanted to make my highlights brighter, I can click on the highlight slider and drag it to the right. And you can see those clouds getting much brighter. I can drag it to the left and darken the highlights. I'm going to set that back to 0 for now. I can do the same thing for my lights. Those are areas that are bright but not quite as bright as highlights. And again, simply move the slider to the left to darken, to the right to brighten. And notice that when I drag these sliders here, I'll move darks here for a second. Watch what happens to the curve. The curve is being adjusted here, but these sliders are saving me from having to go click and place individual points on the curve, and many people find that this is a much more intuitive way to work. However, we do have a great deal of flexibility here. I'm going to go and drag the highlights over here to the left, and you can see that my highlight regions are getting darker and the curve slopes down nicely. What I can do though is fine-tune this adjustment with these region sliders. By default, Camera Raw is defining highlights as everything from, let's say, 75% to 100% brightness. But we can change that by moving this region divider slider. If I drag this to the right, watch what happens to the slope of the curve. It's becoming more narrow. In essence, what I'm doing is telling Camera Raw to define highlights instead as pixels residing at a brightness level of 87% up to 100%. So I'm restricting the definition of highlights. Now if I drag this slider over to the left, I can expand Camera Raw's definition of highlights, making that negative highlight adjustment carry further through the image. Let's set this back here to the default of 75. I can do the same if I move shadows here. I can drag to the left to darken them. And if I want to restrict the effect of the shadows, I can simply go here to this region divider and drag it to the left. So just by using the slider interface here, I do have a fair amount of control. I can set my values here by moving to the left or to the right with these sliders, and I can restrict or expand the definition of the tonal range that is going to be affected. But there's yet another way to work with the parametric tone curve. I'm going to set this region divider slider back to its defaults, and I'm going to reset my shadows to 0. I'm going to tab key, move down to highlight, set that to 0. Up in the top here in our little toolbar, we have what's called a targeted adjustment tool. And if I click and hold on this, you can see that the very first choice here is parametric curve. It has a check next to it. That means that we can affect this parametric curve simply by clicking and dragging on the image. A very, very intuitive way to work. Let me show you how that works. If I simply click in this sky area and drag down, watch my curve. You can see that slope of the curve bending down. You can see that my light slider is moving. That means that the area on which I click, the blue sky here, is defined by Camera Raw as a light. I can drag up and I can brighten those. So you can see obvious changes to the image, you can see changes to the curve, and the sliders move in real time as well. I could go down in here in a darker region. And again, notice how my shadow slider is moving, how the curve is bowing down in the shadows. So I could darken up my shadows ever so slightly. And I could take some values that are lighter than shadows here. Let's see, these will be darks. I could open up my darks at the same time. And of course, I'm still free to adjust these region divider sliders. So if I wanted to expand the definition of my shadows, I can drag to the right. And that will let my -16 value for shadows spread to pixels that are brighter than shadows. If I drag to the left, I can restrict that. So you've got a lot of flexibility here with being able to finely tune your adjustments either by using the targeted adjustment tool or using these highlight lights dark shadow sliders in combination with the region dividers. Now if that weren't enough control for you, we have an additional tone curve here called the point curve. I'm going to click on this point tab. And before I show you the point curve, I want to point out that the parametric curve and point curve work independently of each other, meaning that if you make adjustments to the parametric curve and then make adjustments to the point curve, both of those adjustments are applied to the image. They do not cancel each other out. They will always be used in combination. So if you only want to make adjustments to the point curve, it's very important that you make sure that your parametric curve is set back to its default. So let me set this here to 0, tab down, 0 again, tab down again, 0. So my parametric curve now is at its default. Clicking here on the point curve, we have a pull down menu with some presets. We have a linear curve, medium contrast, strong contrast, and whenever we make changes to any of these presets, the curve pull down will default to custom. Raw files by definition are going to come in very flat and low contrasty. How flat? Well, if we choose the linear curve, which doesn't apply any adjustment, you can see that the image appears washed out. The default in Camera Raw is medium contrast, and that's going to be a great place to start for the vast majority of your images. You can see that the medium contrast curve has a slight S shape to it. The highlights here are opened up just a bit, the mid-tones are kept where they are, and down here where we get into the shadow and dark regions, those are darkened a bit. If we select strong contrast, then we have a more prominent S shape, and you can see that the image becomes much more contrasty. Let's go back here to medium. Now if you're not 100% happy with these presets, they are very easy to adjust. You can go directly on the curve, click, and drag a point up or down. In this case, I'm opening up my highlights. You could move down here and add a point there. You can click an existing point on the curve and drag it up or down. This would be darkening my shadows here. Let's go back to medium contrast. Additionally, you can place points on the curve simply by clicking over the image. If I hover the mouse over the image, and I still have my targeted adjustment tool selected, but it really doesn't matter which tool we have. In fact, I'll change it here to the hand tool. If I hold down the Control key on Windows, the Command key on a Mac, and click anywhere outside this image area, notice that my cursor turns into an eyedropper. And as I move this over the image, I'm not clicking, I'm simply hovering now. You see a hollow circle over the curve interface that tracks my cursor movements. You can also see the RGB numbers directly beneath the histogram update. These RGB numbers represent the pixels directly beneath my cursor, and the hollow circle shows precisely where those pixels underneath the cursor fall on the curve. So if I hover my mouse down in this region, I can click, again, I'm holding down the Control key on Windows, that's the Command key on Mac. If I click, I have a point placed there, and I can adjust this point in one of two ways. With the point selected, I can simply use my up, down, left, and right arrow keys on the keyboard to nudge that point, or I can mouse over, click directly on the point, and drag it in any direction. I could place another point over here. Notice that even though I have the hand tool selected, if I hold down the control key on Windows or the command key on a Mac, I automatically get switched to my eyedropper. And I'll go here to, let's see, another point down in here. You can click, and now I can move this point up or down. Keep in mind I could have used the arrow keys on the keyboard, but I'm clicking here in the curves interface just so you can see visually what I'm doing. So a number of ways to work here with both the parametric and the point curve. Just remember a couple of things. Those two curves work in combination with each other. And it's really your choice as to which one you prefer to work with. Whichever one is easier, whichever one is more intuitive is fine. I would highly recommend, though, starting your point curve at the medium contrast preset. And again, in many cases, that's going to give you a great starting point. In some images, you may just leave it there. If you want to make very subtle adjustments, you can go to this parametric curve here. And if you wanted to, let's say, just bring down your highlights a tad, you're not altering that medium contrast curve. It's still set to the default. You're simply placing an adjustment on top of that curve. So you've got a ton of options here and a lot of flexibility to finely tune your edits with these